We now move forward to the 1930s and the 1940s in our timeline of African Americans post-emancipation. Now, the 1930s, as you may know, is the Great Depression decade, and still today, it's the greatest calamity that ever afflicted the country. And the 1940s, of course, is our entry into World War II. So, what happens during this period? Well, let's remember that the Great Migrations, as I argued earlier, were actually political acts, not just economic. That is to say, it led to a change, profound change in the political landscape of the whole country. But we have to dial back, actually, all the way back to Reconstruction to understand this African American shift in allegiance from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party during the 1930s, the period of Great Depression. So let's go back to Reconstruction. Let's go back to the Republican Party back then. Let's recall that the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. It was the party that African Americans associated with their freedom, their emancipation from slavery, even the 14th and 15th Amendment. Remember the radical Republicans in government that pushed very hard for the guarantee of the black vote with the 15th Amendment and citizenship with the 14th Amendment. All right, so quite predictably, when you have this great migration occur, and now you have the restoration of black votes in the northern cities because they're away from the South, well, who did they vote for, right? Well, quite predictably, their vote initially was still aligned with the Republican Party. But it's important to note this, by this time, the early 20th century, the Republican Party was no longer the party of Lincoln, was no longer the party of black freedom, because it changed. It experienced a change of its orientation and its agenda, and it changed towards the party of big business during the Gilded Age, during our Industrial Revolution. It kind of makes sense, right? During this era of mass industrialization and the rise of the corporate elite like Rockefeller and Carnegie and Morgans and all the others. Well, they got control of the dominant party, and that happened to be the Republican Party still. So, in other words, the Republican Party had changed its orientation from no longer based on black freedom, but upon big business, the party of the corporate elite. Now, what about the Democratic Party at this time? Well, interestingly enough, that party was also undergoing a transition in its ideology. It was the party of, let's remember, the redemption movement in the South. It was the party that you align with when you think about the Southern cause. But by this time, it was starting to undergo, as I mentioned, a political realignment as well. And in particular, it'll be the 1930s that you see this really happening, and the black vote will be crucial to this. But let's ask this interesting question. In the 1932 presidential election, and this is the first election that ushered in, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who would be, one of the greatest presidents in U.S. history. Here was the first year he was running for president. We are amid the Great Depression, 25% unemployment. The country is suffering greatly, especially the middle class and the lower classes. So during the 1932 election, and with the knowledge that African Americans' voting power has been restored because they migrated north, well, who do you think they voted for overwhelmingly? Did they vote for FDR and the Democratic Party or the Republican Party? Well, the answer is, believe it or not, the Republican Party during the 1932 election. Why? Well, it's because in their minds, they still associated the Republican Party as the party of Lincoln, as the party of emancipation, as the party of the promoter of black rights, even though, the party was undergoing transition or underwent transition, as I explained. Okay, so that's interesting. But during this period when Roosevelt was president, you see a change in the 1936 election. And again, we could ask the question 4 years later, when Roosevelt is running for reelection, did the black vote go towards the Democratic Party or the Republican Party? Well, it's interesting to note here that they did shift from the Republican Party, which they now realize is the party of big business and not associated with their freedom, and it shifted towards that of the Democratic Party. Now, this is interesting. Why? Because Roosevelt has a spotty record when it comes to African Americans. Okay. First of all, let's look at some reality of African Americans during the Great Depression. They experienced unemployment 3 times greater, 3 times higher than whites during this time. Moreover, during this time between the 32 election and the 36 election, you see this bill that passed through Congress that would have made lynching a federal crime. This is the anti-lynching bill. But interestingly enough, FDR does not support it. Why? Because FDR understood that he needed the support of Southern congresspersons in order to pass through his New Deal policies and laws. And he knew that he would lose that support if he supported the anti-lynching bill, because Southerners were intent in preserving that Southern way of life, and they were not in support of anti-lynching, obviously. Okay, another interesting thing that happens during the Great Depression, and let's recall, we are underlying FDR's not so great record when it comes to African American support. FDR wants to push through what he calls the Social Security Act. And as you probably know, this is why we have Social Security today. And the Social Security Act was not only meant to provide pension for elderly and retired, but also for those who needed financial help. And in other words, it was a form of financial aid. Now, the South did not want Southern blacks to receive federal aid from the New Deal program. So a compromise was basically struck here for FDR to pass this bill. What they did with the Social Security Act is exclude 2 labor categories or occupational categories that were not eligible to receive federal aid, financial aid. And those categories were, number 1, agriculturalists, as stated here, and number 2, domestic workers. Now, during this time in the South, the 2 major occupations that African American men and women happened to find themselves in were either as farmers and even sharecroppers, in other words, agriculturalists, and women especially found employment as maids and nannies and so forth. In other words, domestic workers. So these served as proxies again, substitutes to exclude African Americans from financial aid that was supposed to be, distributed for those in need during the Great Depression. So there we go. Interesting that these 2 categories were directly aimed at African Americans as a way for this bill to pass through Congress. And not only that, to add upon that, in fact, the Federal Housing Administration, which was a federal government agency that was created to assist those suffering homeowners and to prevent foreclosure of their homes, well, this agency, as stated on the slide, refused to insure the houses of black families. So when you think about it, the cumulative effect here is that African Americans are left out of the New Deal programs for the most part. Now, let's think about the 1936 presidential elections in view of all of what's happening in the background here. We know that in the 32 elections, African Americans associated the Democratic Party as the enemy of African Americans and the Republican Party as the historical friend. Now, during the 36th election, with the Democratic Party in charge because of FDR, you would think that African Americans would still not align their vote or realign it away from the Republican Party and towards that of the Democratic Party. Why? Because of FDR's lack of support for African Americans. But interestingly enough, they voted for the Democratic Party. They realigned their vote for FDR and the Democratic Party. Why? That's the big question. Well, it's because of two factors, really. They understood, to begin with, that the Democratic Party seemed to be the party that was in support of poor people during the Great Depression, as opposed to the Republican Party, which was the party of, again, the corporate elite, the super rich who were largely unscathed by the Great Depression. Okay, so they associated, the Democratic Party and FDR as a friend to those who are poor and suffering. And indeed, the experience with poverty is something that African Americans knew all too well, and therefore they tended to support that cause of the Democratic Party. Now, a second reason is FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, went out of her way, even publicly, to show her support for the African American community. She was known as being a friend and a supporter of marginalized communities in the United States during the Great Depression. And she was even seen, in, let's say, front page photos of her with leading African American leaders. And you have to remember that this is the first time that it seems that African Americans, they seem to have a friend in the highest land of America, even after Lincoln, right? This is the first time that they could see this. It's visible. So therefore, it tended to win over the vote of African Americans during this time. So even today, we see the black vote, for the most part, gravitating towards the Democratic Party. And you may ask, why is this the case? It's exactly what I just discussed here. This is where you see a historical change of the African American vote, whereby they leave behind the Republican Party, which they used to associate as I described, their historical friend back during Reconstruction and even Emancipation, towards that of FDR and the Democratic Party, and such is the case today.